Welcome to a special video version of Rochelle's Daily Wire. This is brought to you from the annual meeting of the National Conference of Bankruptcy Judges in San Francisco. My guest is Professor Bruce Markell. He is the Professor of Bankruptcy and Law and Practice at the Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law. As we do, I have to tell everybody about Bruce's biography, which may take me the better part of 15 or 20 minutes. Bruce started off very auspiciously. He was #1 in his class in kindergarten and continued that streak. In law school, he was even more auspiciously #1 of his class. From there, he went to clerk for none other than Justice Anthony Kennedy, who at the time was sitting on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Enough clerking, and the professor goes off to Sidley in Austin and becomes a partner. I guess that became boring after a while, because the professor then went to teaching for 14 years in law schools. Following that was 9 years as a bankruptcy judge in Nevada, Las Vegas, one of the busiest courts on earth because you were so overmanned at the time. And then 3 years ago, he returned to teaching, which for my money is where you ought to be. However, Bruce,
it's probably where I can do the least damage.
Well, yeah. I'll tell you someplace you could do more damage, but beneficially. I'm going to make a prediction that one of these days you end up on a circuit court bench.
Oh,
the
I'll
7th or the 9th.
No, you don't know my background. I mean, the hearings would be a debacle, but okay.
Yes, but the opinions would be good. That's for sure. Professor, because you have this interesting career of having taught, taken time off to do other things, I'd like for you to reflect, if you would, on how students, law students, have changed from the time you started teaching to how they are now.
Right. When I first started teaching in 1989, Indiana University, and I taught there for 9 years, and then went to start the new law school at UNLV. And along the way, visited various places, including Harvard Law School. And so one of the things you see is that there's a wide range of students and a wide range of abilities. But the one thing that was interesting that kind of keeps coming back to me, with David Epstein, Larry Pomeroff, we do a contracts casebook, and one of the cases that we have is a relatively standard unconscionability case, Williams versus Walker Thomas Furniture. It's a 1966, I believe, case by Skelly Wright from the DC Circuit. It involved a woman who had several children, was on aid to families with dependent children, who had bought some furniture and a stereo from Walker Thomas Furniture. Walker Thomas Furniture had constructed their contracts such that every time you bought something there, they recalculated the balance owing such that as long as you owed them a dime, they had a security interest in everything you ever bought from them. And she had bought beds, she had bought furniture, she had bought a stereo, as I said. And unbeknownst to that, she thought, well, if I paid you enough on the first thing, it was mine, and the second thing was mine. But they kind of spread it out pro rata over everything. And so push came to shove, she couldn't pay. They sought to take her bed, take her stereo, and she wound up actually at the Georgetown Legal Clinic, I believe it was funded by Ford Foundation. And it goes all the way up from DC Trial Court to the DC Intermediate Appellate Court to the DC Circuit, where Skelly Wright writes what is now somewhat classic, although somewhat vague, opinion on unconscionability. And unconscionability is an interesting defense in contract law because it goes to the substance. You can look at actually the terms. You know, students are beaten into submission with the notion that you never look at the equality of an exchange and all that. Unconscionability is a difference. That's where you actually do look at the terms of the contract. And so Skelly Wright also, in the opinion, said you take a look at the capacity of the person. And so she said, listen, this is someone who was trying to make ends meet and could not. And came out with a favorable ruling to the person. Now, when I started teaching, students were very receptive to this. I mean, for whatever reason, they could either identify, or at least they weren't openly hostile to someone in Mrs. Williams' situation. Mm-hmm. As time went on, toward the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, increasing hostility to Miss Williams, as though the problems she was experiencing were only of her own accord. That, you know, if she couldn't pay for the stereo, she shouldn't have taken it. I had students many times in many years say something like that. Why, you know, why do we care about this? Because she promised to pay and she didn't, so that's it. And so I kept teaching contracts when I was on the bench. I was teaching as an adjunct. As the end of the 2000s occurred and up to now, I don't know, I don't want to say she's coming back into favor, but students are much more sympathetic. They tend to, I think, realize that a person's moral responsibility is not necessarily tied to their ability to pay their debts, especially when you're in the kind of situations that Miss Williams found herself in. And so that kind of ebb and flow, I mean, who knows, maybe if I keep teaching, she'll go out of favor again. Yeah. But the basic point is that the students change. Maybe it was the Reagan influence in the early 2000s, I don't know. But you see this kind of change throughout. And you know, I've seen also recently when I've been teaching bankruptcy of students who are just geared for the business bankruptcy. So they want to get, you know, they want to get into the mega cases. But I insist, much to their chagrin, of also teaching some consumer bankruptcy. Yeah. And so I've found our clinic has been, you know, people will come to our clinic and say, you know, do you have any, you know, is there some way I can do some consumer bankruptcy?
I see. So it's not just something they mouth in class. They actually.
I mean, we're actually trying to help. As you know, retired bankruptcy judge Gene Weedoff is doing pro bono appeals for consumers. Right. We're trying to work with him to give some of our students to him to help him make those appeals.
Well, that's wonderful.
So, and I think we're making some headway.
Well, that's good, because he has got some wonderful matters for the students to work on.
He does.
Well, listen, I understand that you have for a while been working on a project for the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. What is a law professor doing working with the International Monetary Fund?
Having a great time is, I think, is the silly answer. The main answer is the IMF often will employ outside experts. And the outside experts they use in areas in where, I mean, they have a very large in-house legal departments. I think it's almost 100 lawyers. But sometimes they will need experience. And at some point after the 2008 meltdown, the IMF decided that one of the things that a vibrant, good economy should have is a working personal insolvency system. Because the way the IMF works is they go in and say, we'll lend you a lot of money, but you got to fix some things in your country's economics, some anti-competitive things, you know, austerity, all that sort of stuff. But for the most part, what they asked me to come in is to take a look, to take a step back. I've worked with them in Ireland, in Bosnia, in Montenegro, in Serbia, in Greece. On the ground, I've been to those places with them. I've also worked with them looking at laws from Pakistan to Bulgaria to Spain. And the idea is, you know, there's a lot of innovation that's not necessary. I mean, in 1990, only 2 of the present European Union countries had a personal insolvency system, Denmark and the UK. It's now up to 20. And in those years, the intervening 25 years, people have all sorts of different insolvency systems which sometimes don't make a lot of sense. And so one of the kind of the catchphrases at the IMF I've heard used is never waste a good crisis. And so if you've got a financial crisis and you want to change a lot of things, that would be the time to do it. So they asked me to come in and say, okay, what's the international best practices on this point? What should we do? How should we kind of respond to this? A good example is Greece. Greece actually has on the books, if you translate it, a pretty decent personal insolvency system. In practice, however, it didn't work. I mean, like most insolvency systems, it provided for a short 60-day stay, once the consumer filed, and then a court hearing to review the propriety. They put that in place, but they didn't change anything else in the system, so many people filed. when I was last there in 2013, if you filed a personal insolvency case in Athens in 2013, you got your 60-day hearing in 2022. So it was a system that's good on the books, but it just doesn't work in practice. And so the IMF is nothing if not practical. And so we were working with the Greek authorities to how do we change the law to break this logjam, to take away this problem. It's a lot of fun, but it's a lot of work too, because the IMF works. I mean, an example, we often would go from like 7:30 or 8 in the morning to 1 or 2 at night. In Greece, we would certainly do that. I remember getting back at 1 o'clock one night in Greece, getting a message on my phone at 2 o'clock that there was going to be a group meeting at 2:30 a.m.
Oh my goodness!
Because you have, things are going on,
Wow.
and not always the host countries aren't always happy to see you there.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
at one point we were in a conference, and we heard this kind of rumbling outside that kind of kept raising. We went to the windows, and the building had been surrounded by 4,000 members of the Communist Party protesting the IMF. We had to be taken out of the building under police guard.
Well, that's not the only interesting place you've been, because when I've contacted you several times in the last year or two, of all places, you've been in Kosovo. What brought you to Kosovo?
Kosovo, I had done some work in Indonesia in the late 1990s, and I'd gone on the bench, and I'd not heard from those people. I got off the bench, and one of the first things I got was an email from somebody who I'd worked with in Indonesia saying, we have this contract in Kosovo. They have a problem with their bankruptcy law. Would you be interested in going there and figuring it out? I said, sure. And so, as it turns out, they had a contract not only just to fix it, but to actually rewrite it. Their law was completely broken. So for the last 3 years, usually during the summer, I've spent a month there in off spring and fall, maybe a week, getting together with a working group of working Kosovars. I had a working group who had the former Associate Justice of the Kosovo Supreme Court, members from, representatives from banks, the accountancy profession, local lawyers, trying to see what works. I mean, to be honest, the statute was passed in June, so I'm very happy about that. To be honest, it looks very much like the American statute, but it had various changes in it. For example, as much as I wanted, Kosovo did not want a personal bankruptcy system. But I said, what are you going to do about the individual sole proprietor, the entrepreneur? And so we drafted the law so that individuals can get a discharge, but for their business debts. And so that was an interesting kind of byplay in terms of, because culturally they were not ready to accept the fact that an individual could default on consumer debts and not pay them. And we worked at that, and I was convinced after a while that now was not the time.
I see. Well, that's interesting observation on how theoretical law has got to meld with the realities of society.
Yeah, if the law doesn't match what people expect, it's just not going to get enforced.
Well, listen, I understand you're working on an article dealing with the Momentive case.
Right.
Until, what's that going to talk about?
It's going to appear in Emory's Bankruptcy Development Journal, and my thoughts have always been that the modern, I don't know if it was the hedge funds that started this or what, but there is a growing kind of desire to say, well, everything's got to be judged by the market. It's got to be market interest rates. Until, of course, is not a market interest rate problem. It's just we take we take a prime rate, we add some numbers. And people have had, there's been an uneasy, well, that's a Chapter 13 case, does it apply in Chapter 11? There's a footnote 14 for that. But I think if you go back and you look historically at the Supreme Court precedent, especially from the 40s, interpreting fair and equitable under both 77B and Chapter X, there's a much greater tolerance for imprecision than current thought would be. I mean, the idea for a lot of secured creditors is we have to get something out of the reorganization we can turn around and sell in the market for exactly what our debt is. That was never the understanding of the Supreme Court on these cases. And so most of the article, I summarize those cases with 3 kind of pithy sayings. In Cramdown, you don't pay too little, you don't pay too much, and you don't expect precision. And that's kind of my take on it. And then I use the Momentum case as the lens through which to kind of look at these kind of observations. Along the way, I take a look at whether debt markets are efficient in terms of kind of the efficient market notion. But ultimately, I come down to the conclusion, I think momentum, Judge Drain was absolutely right to apply momentum in a Chapter 11 case. That not only was he absolutely right and do it, I think there are very good arguments against applying a market-based analogy because the market uses past indicators of financial distress that particularly Justice Douglas thought you should not use when trying to figure out the future value of a firm. And that hopefully will be out sometime in January or February of 2017.
Well, be sure you send it immediately to Judge Drain because I'm sure he will be delighted to hear that folks agree with him, although some other bankruptcy judges have, obviously.
Yeah, he's an interesting and thoughtful.
He certainly is.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true. And so are you. Professor Markell, thank you very much for joining us, and can't wait to read that article and let me know the next time you're in Kosovo.
I will do that.
Thank you.
So
Good
much.
day.